Good evening, everybody. Is this audible?
Yes.
Okay. So we are here now to talk about Pallavi Aiyar's book, which I have read very recently. It's called Travels in the Other Place, Pursuing the Self through 8 different chapters. Now, before I get started on this conversation with her, I thought it would be good to sort of introduce the book, the themes in the book, and it is travel. Okay, and travel is something which all of us do. Many times it is out of compulsion, necessity, and a few times it is out of interest because we want to, it is out of desire. And when you think of travel, I mean, there are many ways to think about it. Of course, at a very basic level, there is literally what is travel. You move from place A to B, and then there is symbolic travel as well. So we talk of travel as a metaphor, that life itself is a journey, right? The journey of the self through life. We talk about all these things. We talk about how travel broadens the mind and so on. So if you break it down into its essence, the way I look at it, travel is any movement from A to B, okay? And when you are getting into this genre of travel writing, a lot of what makes travel writing so interesting, for me at least, is the way the writer talks about this movement, from, usually the movement is from the familiar to the unfamiliar, from comfort to discomfort, from what we think of as normal to what is abnormal or deviation from the normal. And then what this dislocation from the comfort to the uncomfortable, from what is predictable to the unpredictable, what does this dislocation does to your consciousness, to yourself, to your identity. She talks about how when she moved from India to China, she has lived in different continents, in Spain, in China, Indonesia. So a lot of different perspectives, different ways in which your consciousness is broadened. She talks about, for instance, how for the first time she realized that it's not normal to categorize food as veg and non-veg, like we typically do in India, everywhere, in restaurants, at home, and so on. So it's actually abnormal. So that's a shift in perspective on a very small thing. So in this book, Pallavi does this not just in terms of the literal geographical traveling through space, but also travel through time. She travels into her own past in different pockets of life experience, of sickness, of reading books, of parenting, how your own approach to parenting undergoes some kind of a shift, a jolt, when you see how it happens in China, how it happens in Spain, and you yourself are from India. What kind of movements happen in a mind as a parent when you see all these different perspectives? And there is how you deal with loss, grief, the entire dimension of passportism, what she calls as something which drives physical travel in the real world, how it is a different experience for different people depending on what kind of a passport they hold. So there are all these different things to talk about. And on that note, I think I will approach Pallavi now with my first question. So you've been a travel writer, you've been a foreign correspondent in different places, and a lot of your writing up to this point has been about the external travel, okay? But in this book, your journey is inward, into yourself, into your past, into your consciousness, into your journey of the self. What made you want to do this switch in your writing?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that lovely introduction as well. And I'm really pleased to be here, in some ways really launching this new book in this wonderful city of Bangalore. The copies are hot off the press, and the Atagalata bookstore at the festival is the very first bookstore in all of India to be stocking the books. So, cheers to Bangalore. Returning to your question about, this idea of, I've been writing about different countries in the world. I've spent the last 25 years living for substantial periods of time in China, in Belgium, in Indonesia, in Japan, and in Spain, and finally now back in China. And this idea of why I might have been turning internal rather than external. Well, one point is that I actually think that almost all travel is internal. Even when we are externally moving or we are going from one place to another, I think the real consequence of travel in some ways is to make ourselves transparent to ourselves. What do I mean about that? By that, it means kind of making your own internal norms, your own internal lenses obvious to yourself. The kinds of things that you have taken for granted as kind of, they're so normalized that you don't sort of understand that in fact these are not universal, but your very particular ways of looking at the world that are based in your experiences within your family, within your neighborhood, within your city, within your nation. Those only become clear and apparent to you once you leave the comfort of that family, of that city, of that nation, and of that culture. So for example, I don't know, as a foreign correspondent, I would be in Beijing and I would be spending time with, say, a German colleague. And the German colleague would look at the traffic in Beijing in 2007 and say that, it was completely chaotic, that the Chinese didn't know how to drive, that they were switching lanes, and this was kind of causing them stress. Whereas I would look at the same traffic and I would think, my God, nobody is honking, there's no stray cows, it's almost like they're driving with robotic precision. Why is it that the two of us are seeing exactly the same thing, traffic in Beijing, but are seeing something completely different? I'm seeing something orderly and the German is seeing something disorderly. It's because of our implicit norms, what I'm comparing it to, what I'm used to. So what I'm used to is the traffic in Bangalore. What the German is used to is the traffic on the Autobahn. So that kind of lens then only becomes apparent to us in that kind of context. You start realizing what your own norms are, right? What, for example, works as polite conversation. In China, it was quite common for, say, taxi drivers to ask you questions like how much money you earn. In India, as we all know, it's very common for people to ask you if you are married and why not and how many children you have. This would not necessarily work in other parts of the world. Is one normal? Is the other abnormal? I wouldn't call it abnormal. I would just talk about a multiplicity of ways of being in this world. And the more that you travel and the more you are exposed to this, the more you realize that there is no such thing as normal. There's just one normal. There's a variety of different normals. And the point of travel is to accrue these different perspectives and kind of build around you, almost like a snail. You are building a luminescent shell around you by collecting these various frames of reference. And then the other reason I suppose I turned inward was because in 2023, I had somewhat of an annus horribilis, like a terrible year, in which I was diagnosed with, stage 2 advanced breast cancer very suddenly at the age of 46. And a couple of months later, I lost my mother very suddenly in what was quite a traumatic way, in that, I was speaking to her one evening, making plans for the summer, and I get a call the next morning saying that she's gone. So it really felt like being kind of hit by a truck. But that also made me start thinking about all of these kinds of life journeys that we have, journeys into illness, the topography of grief, the topography of parenting. And in many ways, these are also like countries, like landscapes. And some of the lessons that I have learned from being this kind of perpetual peripatetic, wandering across the continents and countries of the world, I've learned something about how to travel well through these movements. And I thought about how I could apply those learnings of how to travel well in the physical world to also learn how to travel well through these kinds of life journeys. When it comes to switchings of the passport, what Susan Sontag called the switching of the passport to the kingdom of the well, everybody at some point switches over to the kingdom of the sick, and so on. How could I travel well in the kingdom of the sick? How could I navigate the topography of grief well? What tools did I have in my toolkit of being a lifetime traveler to also help me navigate these journeys. So that was another reason why I turned inward with this book rather than just talking about a country or a city as I have in the past.
Right, that's a great answer, Pallavi. Thank you so much for that. You spoke about traveling. Well, I think if you want to really uh, drill down to the essence of this book, it is about learning to travel well. And there is, I would say, a certain kind of a self-help element, but in a philosophical way. It's a meditative, reflective book. It's a very intimate book. She talks about her own difficult situations in life and how she navigated it. And I want to quote one sentence which stuck with me, where you write, traveling well is about continuously expanding your identity by making the other your own. Would you like to sort of elaborate on that, making the other your own? I think that's something which you can extend across context as well.
No, no, absolutely. And that's exactly what it is. It softens borders, it softens boundaries. We tend to have a tendency towards tribalisms, right? Like all human beings have a tendency to think this is us and this is them. And I think there's many ways in which you can overcome that. One is, of course, just through reading. But traveling actually puts you, makes you an interlocutor with other real human beings. And they are no longer just somebody that you can demonize in a kind of theoretical way. When you sit down with somebody, when you look them in the eye, when you have conversations with them, that universality that we have of being human beings becomes very apparent. And traveling is an act of developing cognitive empathy. You learn to kind of put yourself in other people's shoes, and you also learn to see different sides of the same story. We grow up thinking about the Ramayana in a certain way. You go to Sri Lanka, and in Sri Lanka, they will tell you that, Ravan was not such a bad guy, and that Sita actually wanted to go off with Ravan, and that she was essentially re-kidnapped by Hanuman. I mean, everywhere you go, you hear a different story to the kind of stories that you had grown up with. And then you realize that, the world is this collection of narratives and stories, and you begin to accrue more of them. I also think, and I hope, that we have the capacity in us, the capaciousness in us, to begin to embrace all of these different things and begin to expand our constituencies of moral concern. What do I mean by that? Our constituency of moral concern is that which we consider to be our own, and therefore we care about it. Protecting people in our family, right? Protecting our children. Then it's protecting our extended family, maybe our neighbors, maybe our people in our country, our fellow Indians. But at some level, I think the more you travel, that constituency of moral concern can begin to expand. At least it should. And I have felt that in my own life, where every city that I have lived in and I've grown to love, something of that has also become mine. I have looked at the Great Wall of China. I have lived there for 7 years, and I feel pride when I see the Great Wall of China. My husband is Spanish, and I've lived in Spain for 5 years. And when I see the Sagrada Familia in the cathedral in Barcelona, I feel like this too is mine. And when I'm in Indonesia, I see some of their classics, and I feel like this is also mine, because this is part of the stream of humanity, and there's been so much cross-pollination. That's the other thing that you realize when you start traveling, that nothing is really your own. Everything has been exported and imported, and we've been in this continuous dialogue over the centuries, whether it comes to food, whether it comes to ideas, design, aesthetics, colors, all of that. There's always been this exchange. So, yeah.
Yeah, as you rightly said, travel is essentially about breaking through borders, and you have this image of this bird on top of a church or a cathedral in Spain, which reminds
storks, yeah.
The storks. Yeah. So birds don't have to deal with passports like humans do, and you have an entire chapter on passportism. Generally, when we think of the passport, we think of it as a document which gives the person access to international travel. But then you sort of explain how passport is a document designed to restrict travel. It's a neo-colonial institution, and you have also a system wherein passport enables you to discriminate without giving out the possibility of being called out for the discrimination. You talk about the passport Brahmins at the top, and then the OBCs and the rest below them. So can you talk a little bit about this concept? Like, how does this passport Brahmin system work, and who benefits from it in that sense?
Yeah, so I mean, this whole idea of passportism is something that I have lived in a very real way, because in my own nuclear family, I have three passport Brahmins and I am the passport OBC, right? Because I'm married to a Spanish passport holder and both my children hold Spanish passports, whereas I have held on to my Indian passport for the last 25 years despite having been in this long-term marriage. And so I'm constantly feeling that, because whenever, for example, we have an opportunity for traveling, say somebody invites us to go on a holiday to Mexico. For the three passport Brahmins in my family, the immediate reaction is, yay, we're going to Mexico. And what do you think my reaction is? Any guesses? So the passport OBC, the first thing I feel kind of terrorized. Like every time I have an opportunity to go anywhere, I can never feel unalloyed excitement, because there is always this it's always tempered by this toxin of visas and this kind of awful visa process I'm now going to have to go through. So I mean, it's interesting with passportism because it's all about a kind of throw of the dice, like which country you ended up being born in or not. And normally, when we talk about many of these kind of Western countries, the former colonial powers today, which sort of collectively form the West, and they're full of virtue signaling, right? In the sense that they would talk about being liberal countries, and the idea of discrimination along many axes would be anathema to them. The idea that we should not discriminate on the basis of birth, like on the basis of caste. India's caste system is abhorrent to them. But passportism is also discriminating on the basis of birth. It's basically institutionalized discrimination on the basis of where you happen to be born in the world. So, while it's not okay to discriminate on the basis of race or color or gender, for some reason on the basis of nationality, it's fine. So much so that there's even objective rankings of which passports are best and which are worst. Every year you have these passport rankings that say, I don't know, the Singaporean passport, best one to have in the world, Indian 88th, Syrian 120th or whatever. I mean, there's actually objective rankings. There's a hierarchy that is accepted, and somehow this is not abhorrent, whereas any other form of discrimination based on birth would be considered to be abhorrent. And as you rightly pointed out, we, in the way that the word passport is used in the English language, it's often equivalent to the idea of freedom, right? So we say things like, this is your passport to a better life. We think about passports as something that facilitate movement. But in fact, the origins of passports were in the restriction of movement. In France, they kind of came up during the French Revolution as a way of preventing peasants from the countryside to be able to move to the cities so as not to cause chaos for urban dwellers. We have a form of that in modern day China today called the hukou, which also regulates the movement of people from rural to urban areas to try to cause minimum disruptions. So passports have always been really more about restrictions rather than enabling movement. And the rules of who got to move and who didn't get to move were set during the colonial period, and we see those power structures persisting till today.
I completely agree with the sentiment in terms of what you said just now about passports, but I do sometimes wonder if India should not borrow that hukou system from China to sort of put a restriction on the number of people who would come into the cities, given the overcrowding and related
I think, I mean, just very quickly to answer that, because it's not directly related to the book, is that brings up the bigger question of, a more sort of authoritarian, dictated ways of doing things in the larger good, and which is something that China has done quite effectively.
Okay, another discussion. Okay, yeah. Now to one of my favorite chapters in the book, Pallavi. I mean, I'm a parent to a 9-year-old, and you, as any parent in the audience can imagine, that parenting is a different territory, which you have to learn to navigate on the go, and you're constantly trying to second guess yourself. Are you doing it right? And you speak about how as an Indian, as someone who's grown up with Indian parenting, you're raising kids in China, and you had to deal with the Chinese tiger mom, both among your co-parents, as in other school parents you have to deal with, as well as Amy Chua, who sort of converts you temporarily into a tiger mom, and then you eventually snap out of it. So, what was this journey like, being a tiger mom and then deciding that you want to be your own kind of mom, so to speak?
Yeah, so actually, what Sampath is referring to was when I was in Indonesia, and my older child, my older son, was about 4 years old, and I happened to come across a book called The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom. And it's written by this American Chinese academic who's called Amy Chua. And when I read it, I felt really appalled at myself, and I began to think I'm like the world's worst parent because I'd been letting down my children by not making them into concert pianists, okay? Because what Amy Chua did with her children was essentially make them into Carnegie Hall the pianists and violinists. And she said that the only way to do this was by drilling down from the time that they were 3 or 4 for hours and hours and hours. And at some point they would start resisting, they would hate it, they would start crying and screaming and yelling. And she said this is the point where most Western parents, white people, they just give up, right? And she said, but the Asian parent knows that this is what you really need to push through, because no child is going to actually want to do a difficult skill when they are learning it, because they're not particularly good at it yet, and so they're not enjoying it. And to be able to make them very good at it, you have to push through this. And then once they are good at it, it creates this kind of virtuous circle where they will love it. And I began to think that I'm just really letting down my children because, I don't know, like when I take them swimming and if they put their head underwater, I jump up and down clapping and give them a vanilla milkshake, when instead I should be insisting that they learn to do the butterfly stroke perfectly before I even crack a smile. So I did go through a phase of sort of tiger parenting, and it was one of the most frustrating experiences of my life because I sort of turned into a monster. My child was unhappy, I was unhappy, and to be honest, I'm not really sure what I gained by insisting on perfect handwriting or perfect spelling. And what was more confusing was that my kids were going to a kind of Australian international school, which had the very opposite pedagogical philosophy. So, I would kind of march into the school and say, my child is 5 and my child cannot, do any handwriting. And they would look at me and say, but the child is only 5. Why are they like writing anything? And, make sure that you buy huge pieces of chart paper and give them crayon and let them just kind of write freely and never between the lines. So, you're buffeted between many winds as a parent. And now, of course, I have teenagers and I also teach in university, and so I'm sort of familiar with Gen Z. And I did realize that I spend a lot of people my age, I think we are called Gen X, if I'm not mistaken, whatever, people born in the late 70s, spend a lot of time complaining about Gen Z, and about how they're dumb and they can't do this and they can't do that. I have to say that I decided to try to treat them like another country. And you know how you say, when in Rome, do as the Romans. It's about learning the norms. It's about learning the language. It's about learning the customs. It's about cognitive empathy to some extent that we were talking about earlier of Gen Z as well. So that's also something that goes into the 4th chapter, which is travels in pedagogy, traveling in parenting.
Yeah. Thank you, Pallavi. I don't know if you have time for questions. 4 minutes. Okay, if you have 4 minutes, do you want to read a little bit from the book? Okay.
Hello. Hey Pallavi. Read your Substack and your articles in different newspapers, so I enjoy them a lot. I would like to ask you about something personal that you wrote recently on your Substack about how the world seems to be turning against Indians and how from being model minorities, they are being singled out. So any thoughts about where did this happen and what are the roots of it, and is it only American culture which is where we can see the expression of it, or is it worldwide from your personal experiences and from what you understand about the geopolitics?
So to be honest, it was something that came as a surprise to me because this is something that is inhabiting certain algorithms in the world that I don't tend to be part of. And I only really became aware of it when my children began talking about it and saying things like they were being sent a lot of memes by classmates about Indians being dirty and Indians being stinky and, you know, all kinds of things. And they were being quite traumatized by this, although their friends sort of just seemed to think that this was funny. And initially I thought, who are these awful children, until I realized that the internet is actually flooded with these memes and these are being sent to the kids. So, you know, in some ways it's not even things that they are coming up with, but what's being pushed to them. I don't know. I believe that it's been about 2 years since in the US, a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment turned from being anti what they call Asian, i.e. East Asian, Chinese, and, you know, the China virus during COVID. And then it seemed to have kind of turned towards Indians much more. It's obviously, there's this anti-immigration movement that we're seeing all around the world. It's kind of got a purchase among some of the MAGA crowd. You know, it's getting clicks, it's getting likes. So like, because it's getting attention, then it's kind of encourages people to push more of this out there. And I've sort of, as far as I know, there's a lot of this in the Anglosphere. So in Canada, in the UK, Ireland, Australia, and indeed a lot of it is now turning against white collar professionals, which was a kind of group that used to think that they were sort of safe from this kind of thing. But I also think that kind of, you know, speaks to the fact that even if you are white collar, you need to grapple with issues of immigration and not think that you are some kind of special caste. At least we are like special. We are not special, you know, so you have to have that kind of solidarity across the board, I think.
Pallavi, I'm an old friend of your mother's, of Gitanjali, and very sorry to hear about her passing away. But my question is actually because I worked as a diplomat for 36 years. You know, I felt that experience of living for 3 years in different countries throughout my career enriches your life in a way that a global traveler can't really experience, a casual traveler can't experience. So would you agree that you really need that experience of staying for 3 years or 4 years or 6 years or 9 years, as in your case, in a particular culture to truly understand that culture and to enter into it fully?
Yes, I mean, the longer you can spend, it helps. But there are also people who spend long periods of times in a certain culture and don't actually end up learning very much about it. So, you know, it's about meeting this world with openness, with curiosity, with a sense of wonder, and with a kind of gung-ho attitude about, you know, diving into it. I think language is a very important part. And I have a chapter in this book about traveling through languages, which I had wanted to read from, but we were out of time. You know, making mistakes is not the point. It's about kind of grappling with that. So you can live sometimes for many years in a place and not really engage with it in a deep level. And I think sometimes you can just be a traveler passing through. But if you have a kind of openness of attitude, you can get a lot more from it than somebody who's lived in a place for many years. But as a rule, obviously, the longer that you can be somewhere, the deeper will be your understanding, the deeper will be your relationships with the place, and the deeper will be your ability to really put yourselves in the cognitive framework of that particular culture. Yeah.
Thank you, Pallavi, for a great conversation, and thank you to the audience for
Thank
your
you so
attention,
much.
for listening in. And I urge all of you, if you love thought-provoking, engaging reading, please go and grab a copy of the book from the bookstore. Thank you so much.